Hey everyone, this is Ben from Stark Knives, and today I have another new knife making project to share with you. This one is going to be a Sanmai Wharncliffe, and the steel is some beautiful W2 coarse Sanmai with a stainless steel jacket. I'm starting the process by tracing the outline of the profile of the knife using a pencil. I'm giving this one around a 3.75 inch blade roughly and a 4.5 inch handle. I find that's a really good size for a larger EDC style blade, and that is the general type of use that I'm going for with this one. And then once I have the profile traced out, I go over to my portable bandsaw with a bimetal blade to cut out the rough profile of the knife. This saves a ton of time over what I used to do, which is use a hacksaw. As you can see here, I can really get pretty close to the final profile using the bandsaw, and then it's time to move over to the grinder in order to do the final profiling. I start profiling with a worn out 60 grit belt on the flat platen, because that will enable me to get the nice angular look on the flat portions of the blade that I'm going for. On a more curvy knife, I'll typically maybe use an 8-inch contact wheel, which will help me get a more curved look. And the reason that I use a worn out belt for the profiling is that often profiling knives can strip off the grit really quickly from a new belt, and that will waste a lot of the life of the belt. So by using a slightly worn out one, where it doesn't really matter too much if I build up heat, you can save quite a bit of money in the long run. Once I have the majority of the knife profiled, I switch over to my small wheel attachment in order to do the inside radii of the handle area. And since I'm unable to reach those with the flat platen, I have to switch over to my 1/2 inch contact wheel in order to get into those little areas. After taking the profile up to a 120 grit finish, I like to insert my jimping and also the sharpening notch into the blade. I do that with a 5/32 chainsaw file, and the jimping adds a little bit of grip and some interesting visual contrast on the top line of the blade, and then the sharpening notch enables you to sharpen the edge all the way up to the heel of the knife. Now it's time to drill some holes into the tang of the knife. Before I do any hole drilling, the knife is almost 8 ounces, and I just want to show you how much weight reduction you can achieve by drilling holes into the tang. So I start by using on the drill press a cobalt drill bit, and I drill the pinholes in the lanyard holes. And then after that, I fill in the entire handle with some additional weight reduction holes before countersinking all of them. And then after we do all the hole drilling, you can see that that already takes off almost an entire ounce off of the final weight of the knife. Now it's time to put on a fresh 60 grit belt and start doing some initial grinds on the bevels. I start this with the flat platen in order to get the nice flat grind on the blade. I leave the edge pretty decently thick and just polish it up to 120 grit before using a coarse Scotch-Brite belt, because you don't really need to go any higher before heat treating the knife. Here you can see the thickness that I leave on the edge. It's thin enough that you don't have a ton of grinding to do after heat treat, but it's thick enough that you don't have to really worry about any warpage. Now that it's time to heat treat the knife, I'm going to go ahead and fire up my even heat kiln and turn on my W2 heat treating regimen. That is going to be turning on the oven to around 1475 degrees Fahrenheit. And then once it's up to temperature, I put the knife in, let it come back up to temperature, and then let the blade soak at that 1475 temperature for around 10 or 15 minutes. Once it's time to quench, I get my Parks 50 quenching oil prepared and have it in this nice big ammo container in order to make sure that I have enough oil to heat treat properly. I have my quenching oil set up right below the entrance to my heat treating oven, and that enables me to get the knife into the oil as fast as possible. After quenching, I like doing a quick hardness test using one of my chainsaw files, and since it's just skating across the edge without biting in, that's a good indication it's nice and hard. And then in order to bring some toughness back into the steel, I'm going to temper the knife at 400 degrees for 2 hours and then do 2 cycles of that with cooling the blade in between. first thing I do after the blade is done heat treating is surface grind the flats in order to have a nice flat surface to attach the handles on and also grind to. So I do that with a 60 grit belt and then polish it up to my finished grit as well. And then I start working on finish grinding the bevels. I first put on a fresh 60 grit belt to thin them out, and then I grind them all the way up through a progression of 120, Trizact A100, Trizact 45. At this point, I also put a swedge on both the front bevel and the top line of the knife, because that enables me to get some really awesome pattern showing through on all surfaces of the blade. Here you can see the final polish of the bevels before etching. I always degrease before doing the etching process as well. And now it's time to reveal the pattern in the steel, which I do by first etching in ferric chloride acid for around 15 to 20 minutes. I have it cut down to a 50-50 mixture with water, and that enables me to see the nice dark pattern. Once the blade is etched, it's time to finally start working on the handle. The material that I picked out for this build is a black honeycomb resin with a white G10 liner. The first step is just to kind of trace out the profile and then cut it out on the bandsaw like we did with the blade earlier. And then I end up gluing the liner to the scale material using some epoxy. I then drill some 3/16 inch pinholes and a 1/4 inch lanyard tube hole on the drill press that I'll use to attach the handle with using some hardware. Once it's time to glue the handle material onto the blade, I have some stainless steel pins and some G-Flex epoxy. Here you can see how the weight reduction holes that I drilled earlier also enabled me to get more epoxy in between the handle material and the blade. This provides a better bond and it makes sure that the handle is attached really securely. I then just clamp everything together and let the epoxy cure overnight. The first step is going to be removing all of the excess handle material from the perimeter of the knife. I start by removing the excess pin material on the bandsaw, and then I'm going to move over to the grinder in order to remove some of the excess handle material with another 60 grit belt and the small wheel attachment. Once I have everything profiled to the outside of the tang, I start doing some contouring using the flat platen. This is another 60 grit belt, and I just start breaking all of the edges and rounding things over, and that helps me get some nice rough contouring. I like to use a lot of different areas of my grinder in order to do the handle contouring. So for example, here I'm using the tracking wheel of the grinder in order to do some of the inside radii contours, and I'll also use the 2-inch contact wheels of the flat platen in order to do some of the other contours. In order to blend all of those rough contours together, I remove the platen in order to get a slack belt, and then I'll use this scalloped 1x72 J-Flex belt to blend everything together. You can see that the scallops enable the belt to not dig into the handle material anywhere, and that helps blend everything nicely. This one is a 220 grit belt, and I find that that grit is a really good setup for my hand sanding process, which I start at 320 grit. Now it's time to hand sand, and like I mentioned, I start with 320 grit before going up through a progression of 600 grit, 1000, and 2000 grit. On these sand my blades, I want to have the pattern be revealed across the entire perimeter of the tang, so after hand sanding I polish everything back up to a 400 grit cork belt before I buff the handle and the perimeter of the tang using my buffing attachment with some pink scratchless compound. That gives both the handle and the tang a really nice high mirror polish finish. Now in order to reveal the pattern along the tang, I just dip the entire knife back into the ferric chloride acid to reveal the pattern. I wouldn't recommend doing this on something like a wood handle, but on a resin like this, it doesn't end up making any difference on the actual handle material. So here you can see after a few minutes that the pattern is revealed across the entire tang, and after a nice coating of oil, it gives it a really striking finished look. Now it's time to do the final step of sharpening the edge. I set the edge using a 120 grit belt before polishing it up with a 400 grit belt. Then, once the burr is raised across the entire edge, I use my leather stropping belt that's loaded with green compound to give the edge a final polish and also remove the burr. Last but not least, it's time to etch my name onto the blade, which I do using my Personalizer Plus etching machine with a vinyl stencil of my name. I just have some electrolyte solution onto the etching pad and then mark my name onto the blade. And here's the finished knife. I'm super happy with the high contrast blade finish that I got on this one, and I think it really matches nicely with the dark black and white handle. It kind of gives it a really cool, modern, and sleek look overall, and I think that that is a really good fit for this overall blade design. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this knife come to life, and if you have any questions about the process, please let me know in the comment section below, and I'll do my best to answer them as best as I can. So if you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and be sure to stay sharp. Thanks for watching.